So welcome again, everybody. It's absolutely awesome to see all of you here, and it's the last one we're going to do this year, probably. It might just be a surprise in December. But it's been the most wonderful experience having coffee with God with everybody. And it's so nice to see the regular people coming in all the time. Thank you so much for joining. It's such a blessing, and it's a ministry, and it's a space of love all over the world. Welcome, Brenda from Canada. That's the only one I know who's overseas who's joined here today. And Brenda's also written a book, which we'll be talking about next year. Anyway, so today's Coffee with God is Sharon and Larry talking about their books. But I just want to say before they begin about very little about my experience with spiritual reading, which I've been very fortunate to have access to amazing books because of Larry, who most of you know. He's passed on such good books to me. And during very hard, difficult times, at the time I didn't know it, but now many, many years later, I realized that how much the spiritual books influenced me, supported me, led me through my life. And then I can say the same for Larry and Sharon's books, both of them. I've always said they complement each other, the two books. Sharon's offers practical possibilities for a more contemplative life. And Larry's narratives of the characters from the Gospel of John offer us encouragement when we see how we and the characters are transformed gradually by Jesus. Jesus is at the heart of each narrative. Like he accompanied them, he accompanies us. So both books take us gradually through contemplation and action and discipleship. So over to Larry and Sharon. They're going to decide how they're going to do this, and I'll chat to you. And feel free to chat after they're finished or put questions into the chat. Over to one of you, Larry and Sharon.
All right, I'll begin because I'm going to be talking about spiritual reading quite broadly and how it's impacted on me and how it can grow our spiritual lives. And spiritual reading for me has been a comfort and a delight for many years. Way back to my young adult years when I started reading authors like Tony Campolo and Floyd McClung. And then gradually these gave way to deeper contemplative reading of authors such as Henri Nouwen, Richard Raw, and Cynthia Bourgeois, just to name a few of them. And I found in books a kind of wise guidance and companionship of fellow pilgrims on the spiritual search, and an ever expanding and deepening sense of God and of the journey of actual inner experience and attentiveness. And spiritual reading has also been a key part of the process of writing my book, Contemplative Living. The chapters of the book are based on talks or reflections that I've given either at Dove Fellowship or on various retreats. And typically each talk emerged from some reading that I was doing, where I experienced some inner stirring, insight or invitation. And then as I worked with this in my own life and as it ripened in me, it would come together into a talk. And so in a way, I was learning as I went along rather than writing from a position of being an expert. And I used input from the reading that I was doing and my own experiences in prayer and silent retreat times, together with a sense of the Spirit's gentle guidance to open the way. And so that's how the book has come to be, very much from my own inner journey that I shared in those chapters. So to talk a little bit more about spiritual reading itself, my sense is that it does not primarily involve trying to wrap our heads around something or fill our heads with knowledge about God or theology. And that does have its place. We do need to be challenged by new perspectives, bigger pictures, ways of understanding God, scripture, what community means, and also a sense of what the universe is about, how expansive it is, so that we don't get stuck in our very small pictures and projections. But it's very important that our spiritual reading be transformative. And to do this, ultimately, it needs to draw us deeper in our experiential relationship with God, perhaps by stirring our hearts to be more open to God in a fuller kind of surrender, or reminding us of why we even pray, or how we can live out this relationship in the world, giving our inner life expression in the outer world. And there I found Richard Rohr's writing incredibly life-changing, helping me to see the life and teaching of Jesus in a way that has stirred me deeply and given me insight into scripture that has softened and opened my heart outwards towards others. But spiritual reading can also be a reminder to shift from listening to the voices out there, to the experts. Sometimes I find myself kind of groping around for some qualified person who will give me the insight I need for the day or to guide me through this. And sometimes, interestingly, spiritual reading can remind us to attune to the inner voice of love. And so I want to read a few examples that I've found really inspiring in moving deeper into this kind of inner listening. One is Isaiah 55. Come to me, all you who are thirsty, come to the waters. And you who have no money, come, buy and eat. Come buy wine and milk without money and without cost. Why spend money on what is not bread and your labor on what does not satisfy? Listen to me, and eat what is good, and you will delight in the richest of fare. Beautiful invitation to come and receive. And then Henri Nouwen, he's written a beautiful book called The Inner Voice of Love, and he wrote, only by attending constantly to the inner voice can you be converted to a new life of freedom and joy. Attending to that inner voice. And so that's where writing is reminding us to listen to this inner voice. And then the Quaker author Thomas Kelly wrote in his book, A Testament to Devotion, there's a deeper and internal simplification of the whole of one's personality, stilled, tranquil, in childlike trust, listening ever to eternity's whisper, walking with a smile into the dark, where the breath and stillness of eternity are heavy upon us, and we are wholly yielded to him. Hasten unto him who calls you in the silences of your heart. The voice of the shepherd is calling us home. This beautiful invitation. And still on this point of spiritual reading, reminding us to listen deeply. A few lines from a Rumi poem. Make everything in you an ear, each atom of your being, and you will hear at every moment what the beloved is whispering to you, just to you and for you, without any need for my words or anyone else's. But for me, this shows the paradox of spiritual reading. The words of other people can stir something deep within us that arises from a place in us that's beyond words and draw us to listen to these depths, to the inner voice of love. But in order to listen, we have to know when to put other people's words aside and simply listen in the kind of childlike, simple silence of our own hearts. And so it's a kind of an art or a skill that we need to learn. When do we need guidance from someone else's words? And when should we set aside time to attune in silence? Learning to hear the Spirit for ourselves, or even just remain lost for a while in the quiet unknowing of mystery's presence. Sometimes that can be profound, that kind of waiting. And that's one of the most delicious challenges in the spiritual journey, is to develop that art of when to be guided and when to remain still and listen within. And spiritual reading can also guide us on the journey of growing inner awareness and provide vital support during times of deep anguish, as Bonnie has talked about, giving us a kind of a literacy to recognize what is happening and to see how God shows up in our lives in completely unexpected ways, and to learn to trust what God is doing, even in, or maybe especially through, the turbulent times. And there've been many helpful guides for me in that, but a few of them are Sue Monk Kidd, her book When the Heart Waits was really helpful for me at the time. Tara Brach, Matt Licata, and Martin Laird, his book Into the Silent Land, has got a beautiful section on working with fear, pain, and even our cravings. But I want to read a few lines from Matt Licata, who has been a faithful companion to me through some times of real anguish. And this is typical of his kind of writing. He wrote, "You want the journey to feel safe, to provide answers to your questions and resolution to the burning which has been placed inside you. But love cannot provide these things. The beloved works by deflation and through the reorganization of the known. She is seeding your nervous system with drops of outrageous creativity. However, this activity is bewildering to the mind and to the entirety of the conceptual process. It is inside the gates of your inner sanctuary that the sacred material is being assembled, reconfigured, and mobilized by love." And I found that time and time again, his writing, but that of others as well, have reminded me that even the times of anguish are the work of love, and to learn to trust that and recognize what is happening. Speaking more specifically about contemplative spirituality, in a sense, spiritual reading can seem to be a contradiction in terms, because contemplation is ultimately about silence. But I found spiritual reading to be vital in my own contemplative journey for various reasons. Sometimes I'm stopped in my tracks of typical sort of mind burbling by a line of a psalm or a teaching of Jesus or some other verse from scripture or a mystical poem or something. It's something that brings about an opening of the mind and heart as an awareness that is greater than my own cognition. And this is the power of sacred texts, being able to penetrate our thicket of ordinary consciousness with rays of divine wisdom. And I'm sure many of you have had this experience after a quiet time where your perspective has totally shifted from some small self-absorbed tangle to an encounter where you've experienced grace and insight and a release from that small vantage point. And that's one of the real gifts of spiritual reading. I also find it helpful to be reminded of why I'm doing my daily contemplative practice. Otherwise, it's too easy to fall into sort of mechanical, like, tick the box routine. Good, I've done that for the day, tick. And I need to be reminded of the attitude that I'm bringing, of open surrender and consent to God's presence and action in me, letting go over and over again. And I find I can never be reminded of this enough because I too quickly try to get it right or to drive the process myself. And so here I find the writings of people like Father Thomas Keating, David Frennett, and Cynthia Bourgeau really helpful. And I want to read an example from David Frennett's book called The Path of Centering Prayer, which I find often just a few lines from that book, and I know, whew, okay, I remember what I'm doing here. And in this excerpt, he wrote, "Relating to the living God includes saying yes to God's unimaginable indwelling presence. The radical consent of deepening contemplation means something even greater, saying yes to God's presence acting in you. As you continue in contemplation, you learn more about how to let God's presence act in you as the source of your prayer and the source of your life. Such a lovely reminder that the core of contemplative practice is to simply let go and consent to whatever God is doing in us. Sometimes in our reading, we come across those one-liners that just completely stop us in our tracks, waking us up from the dream that we've been lost in. What Finlay describes as language in service of the unsayable. I love that line, language in service of the unsayable, where the words themselves give way completely, leading us into the silence of simple being. And I found this happening through a wide range of sources, such as Psalms, Jesus' teachings, Merton's journals, Rumi, Hafiz, Eckhart Tolle, Adyashanti Gangaji. But in truth, the sources are endless, because none of this takes place without the initiation and grace of God. When we do find ourselves in a completely new space, when we've felt that brush with eternity, when our hearts burn within us, we know that we've been graced with the presence of the Living One, who uses the words to touch us at a place in our being that is far deeper and more mysterious than any words. And so, to sum up, my highly sophisticated way of assessing whether a book is right for me at the time is to ask myself, does it make me want to pray? That's really what it boils down to. Because prayer for me is where I surrender myself to the transforming love, presence, and action of God. It's a place where we remember that we're utterly dependent on God to produce anything fruit-like or compassion-like in our lives, and where we deepen our awareness that in this moment we are already held in God, one with God, in whom we live and move and have our being. Thank you. Larry, over to you.
Wonderful, wonderful. Thanks, Sharon. And just to say I resonate with so much, with everything that you've said, and to carry it on a little bit so that we can open it for discussion. I always think of that line from the movie Shadowlands, the story of C.S. Lewis. Oh no, yeah, I think it was called Shadowlands, but it's his whole experience of meeting Joy, whom he married, and then her very early death and his grief that he recorded after that. But somewhere along the line in the movie, he encounters somebody who asks him the question, why do you read? And he said, we read to know we're not alone. And I think that sums up for me in many ways the value of spiritual reading. Because whether it is autobiographical or biographical or not, there's still a sense of not being alone in what you're reading in others. So when people are writing about the contemplative life, for example, you mentioned Martin Laird's book, Into the Silent Land. It's not autobiographical, but you know it is. You know that it's coming from a very deep place within him, and that he has matured in these thoughts and crystallized his insights, so that when you're reading him, you feel that you're journeying with him in that process. But having said that, I want to come back to my point about autobiography and biography, because that is an area of spiritual reading that has perhaps had the most impact on my own life. literally reading to know you're not alone. And one of my earliest readings of something autobiographical was the Confessions of St. Augustine. And I go back to them time and again, because they are the most extraordinary but appropriate self-revelation, where you journey with him and you say, wow, you know, I'm not alone in this. And all of his writing is constantly addressed to God. So he tells his story, but to God, and then you're almost as if you're eavesdropping in on his relationship with God. Another example of that is Teresa of Avila and her autobiography, Thérèse of Lisieux and hers. And perhaps my special favorite next to my bed at all times is Etty Hillesum, whom I discovered just by reading an article, by the way, in passing, sort of 1983. And I said, I've got to get hold of this book, because her autobiography, which is really, it's her diaries of 2 years during the war in Amsterdam prior to her arrest and deportment to Auschwitz. And she kept a very close diary, and it was only translated into English in 1983. So it was relatively fresh off the press when I got hold of it. And she writes about herself as the girl who would not kneel, the girl who could not kneel, and how she struggled to pray and how she struggled to surrender. And then eventually she does. So there's another example of something autobiographical, or the Seven-Storey Mountain of Thomas Merton. So I really do love reading the other people's journeys and find myself resonating with it, but also being challenged, because as you say, the litmus test is, does it lead you to prayer, but does it lead you to want to be a better person and to better self-knowledge and insight? So that's just to reciprocate from your sharing. But I want to say something too about the method of spiritual reading, which ties in with what you said. But there's always a danger for somebody like me, trained in theology, to read books like theology books, and to read them critically, and to read them to gain knowledge, and to read them fast, and to read the latest come out from the latest theologian. Spiritual reading is not that. And it's absolutely vital to switch mode, to switch into a different method of reading, in fact, to pray your reading, and to be willing to stop and reflect. And if I can get no further than half a page, it's fine. Because this spiritual reading is actually prayer in itself, in and of itself. And I think back to my very earliest directed retreat with Sister Annette Boyle when she came to South Africa. Some of you might have heard of her, know her. And my mind being blown by the method of a directed retreat, because all we got as novices and students was retreats with sermons 6 foot above contradiction, you know. Nothing engaging, really. It was more input, more theology. Haven't we had enough of it all semester? And Annette taught me, and you quoted Isaiah, and that was one of her first passages, taught us in directed retreat to stop at a word that strikes you, and to discern whether this is Spirit Sophia stopping you, the Holy Spirit herself saying, I have something to say to you in this word, not necessarily the whole paragraph. And what strikes me and why does it strike me? So I would say with the methodology of spiritual reading, to do it slowly, to do it gently, to allow it have a pace of its own, that you can't rush it. And then just to move on, because we've both published books, to link it to the book that I published, Become Love, on the Gospel of John. That's exactly the style that I've tried to adopt in that book, the narrative biographical style, telling the stories of John's characters through the lens of gradualness, how their journeys gradually matured and unfolded, how their insights gradually became deeper and more enlightened. And so here I'm fascinated by the notion of biography, autobiography, and the law of gradualness in our journeys. And that's really why I wrote that book, because I thought, I've read Augustine, I've read Therese and Teresa and John of the Cross and Etty Hillesum, but there's some wonderful biographies in the Bible. And let's begin with the book I love the most, the Gospel of John. So that's my little sharing. But just to say that I'm very keen to hear from others, their experience of spiritual reading and its value in their lives.
Thank you, Larry and Sharon. Gosh, I really love having both of you on the Zoom together. What a wonderful combination. So now over to everybody else. Please feel free to put in the chat if you have a question, or raise your hand, or just unmute yourself and everyone will get a turn.
Looks like Elsabe is going to talk.
Thank you for both of you saying what you did. I think I don't know whether I would be where I am without spiritual reading from way back when. And I think there are rhythms, there have been rhythms in my life as well. There have been times when I have done almost the opposite of what both of you were suggesting, is almost devouring books because I was so hungry. And it was like trying to discover and to find. And I think as I'm getting older, I'm finding the gift of almost being unable to read a lot, a very different rhythm, because for me that a phrase or a sentence can set me off on a whole inner journey. And so I found it quite consoling to hear the way in which you're talking about it, because it is less and less about gaining knowledge and more about trying to let go, actually. And I, if somebody's words are helping me along that way, to let go, to understand what it is that I'm being invited into. So for me, over the years, my pattern of spiritual reading has changed quite considerably.
Can you hear me?
Yes, Moira, go ahead. I can hear you.
I just listening to the two people, to Larry and to Sharon speaking, it made me suddenly realize how so often I'm drawn to a book in my bookcase, and I pull it out and read parts or read the whole book or parts of it, and I'm amazed that I felt like I've never read it before. It's like a different message or a different story coming out the same book that I've perhaps read 3 or 4 times before. And yeah, I just find that amazing, and it always seems to be the book that's right for me at that time.
Go ahead, Nontando.
Thank you so much, and I'm sorry I came a bit late, but I was able to catch the last part. You know, what struck me in the reflection about the books that have, you know, enriched us is that whole African understanding of spirituality as communal. That, you know, when we think about societies that have no written text, indigenous societies, that they were built by the stories, sitting around the fire, listening to grandmother telling stories, and you know, strangers who are coming across to visit, telling stories, and how that whole communal, we may not have like a community sitting around, but the books have become a community, even though they're sitting on our shelves, but they are community. Those are people that tell these stories, like what you're saying, you know, you know, the autobiographies, they tell these stories, and we, you know, just that sense of community, that we draw from each other, we feed from each other, and through listening to one another, whether it's through a story that's thousands of years in the Bible, or yesterday from the newspaper, that sense of community as a way of shaping us. I always think about, you know, like communities, like even a simple thing like a mirror, you know, communities that didn't have mirrors, they were each other's mirrors. You know, you know, even when you're looking at a physical sense, that people would be able to you know, to describe you, because you have never seen yourself. Other people become the describers of who you are. You know, just again that whole mirroring that others have of us and we of them, and that whole communal just got affirmed for me, because I too love books, and you know, sometimes you find it's not easy to have the community, but we need to rethink community as the books and as the people in scripture, so that even when we are moving in different parts of our lives, even having the book or the autobiography or the Bible becomes a communal thing, because we're not alone. And I just, yeah, it just kind of fed me in that way. So thank you to both of you.
I just have a question. If there's anyone out there to whom this whole concept of spiritual reading is still a new concept, what advice would the two of you give to someone like that?
Well, I hate giving advice because it can often be very subjective, except to say that part of my novitiate training and my formation in religious life included conferences on spiritual reading per se. And it's simply making the point that spiritual reading is something that you have to learn and grow into. And we've already made the point that it's different from voracious reading trying to gain knowledge, that the purpose of spiritual reading is something that you've got to keep to the fore all the time. I am doing this so that I may be inspired. And perhaps the best place to start is the scriptures and the Psalms that Sharon also endorsed. Or to know what kind of reading would really work for you. As I said, I like biography and autobiography and narrative. Others like poetry. And if poetry is your format, then take some inspirational poetry. And in fact, I find that one of the best at the moment in my life. So make use of something that really works for you and grow into it, learn it, be open-minded as you approach spiritual reading. Sharon?
Yeah, I think I resonate with what Elsabe said earlier, that sort of the how can shift as you go along. So there's no sort of one particular how, but more just to be aware of what is resonating for you. There's no sort of standard textbook or on this, but to start to kind of feel what and be okay to discard what isn't working for you. I think that's quite important, is that some people can get quite stuck in a almost dutiful reading, and if it's not bringing you alive, if it's not making something gasp with freshness inside of you, then put it aside, because then it's not the right book for you at the time. So I think have the freedom, and sometimes it will be not Christian at all. Sometimes you'll need to move to like the poetry of Rumi and Hafiz or whatever. So I think it's about the sensing within what is real for you, and that's how the Spirit is going to speak to you. There's always going to be a sense of freshness and aliveness that should resonate with what you're reading. I see B. Mullen, sorry, I don't know your name, but you've had your hand up for a while. Do you want to talk?
Yeah, when I entered religious life very young, like I think I was 17, and spiritual reading was an absolute penance, because we never chose anything. And we were given, well, I was given a thick book on theology of some kind by a bishop somebody. And for an hour or two a day, you knelt in a chapel, and this was your spiritual food. And it was just utterly, another word for, don't have it anymore, but purgatory for me. And then we once, when I became a novice, we could choose a book to read. And I came across a poetically written journey of the Passion of Jesus, written through the mind of Mary. And all of a sudden, I became aware that what you read should reflect life and reflect the images of God in people and reflect yourself as an image of God. And I fell in love with poetry at that stage of my life. And then the other book that's had extraordinary and impactful meaning for me is not a religious book. It's Cry the Beloved Country by Peyton. And that book showed me that you find God in every single traumatic, beautiful, simple situation, And that's who God is in us. Because those books, or that book particularly, was really a very deep love story of how God is in everything we are and in every situation we are. So it lifted me into a kind of a world where I felt free to be who I am. And it freed me to see other people as Jesus in a particular way. People are Jesus. We are all Jesus. And we all grow into that completeness of Jesus. So for me, spiritual reading is about that. And what is most profound is the silence that those things bring to us. Because silence is the prayer of God in us. It's actually not our business what goes on, because we abdicate and we give to God in that silence. And somehow our behavior changes and our attitudes change. I might be having a raging temper and a tantrum, but somehow that's sustained in God. I don't know if I'm talking rubbish or anything, but that's how I see the importance of spiritual reading. And mostly I read the mystics and poetry and the songs.
Thank you.
And I love John too. But yeah, all the theology and stuff kind of clutters things for me. Thank you.
Thank you, Bernie.
Anne Wigley? Anne?
Yes, thank you. Yeah, I want to thank
Go for
you.
it, Anne.
Thank you all for your sharings. It's part of that community that keeps on inspiring me to carry on. Not that I need any impetus, because since before I could read, I was reading poetry through my mother. She used to read us A.A. Milne and Robert Louis Stevenson and Paul Gallico and all those kind of things when we were very tiny. And I've read ever since. And it's affected me profoundly. And like you, Larry, poetry has been one of the chief things for me. Hafiz, particularly Hafiz, his poems stick in my head like nothing else does. I can read it once and nearly know them. And they go with me. And the things I read from small on and from my novitiate on, especially, they stay with me today still. I remember Trish and I used to read the Psalms. Every Sunday we read one psalm from Piers Parsh, and he taught us already to stay with one line, not to try and remember the whole psalm, and stay with that, and we did. And it was inspiring then, and it still is inspiring. The things that I read then I still remember today, and I find it extremely helpful reading with even novels. I read novels too, and they the lives of people, and it inspires me. I read them slowly, I don't read them fast. And I just want to say thank you, and a very big thank you to you, Sharon and Larry. I have both your books. I read yours, Sharon. I bought them at the same time, and I'm still busy with yours, Larry. I'm at the poetry at the end now. But I'm very grateful to both of you. Thank you.
And Fiona, you've had your hand up.
Yeah, I wanted to say how enriching I find it to share with people about a book. And I've always read from when I was very young, and I've always loved reading. But a couple of years ago, a friend of mine, I went to a movie with her, and we went out for supper afterwards and talked about the movie. And it was so wonderful to do that, because I hadn't had that experience before. And since then, I've often been able to share about books with people after I've read a book. And, you know, the Into the Silent Land that both Larry and Sharon mentioned, you know, we're in a group at the moment sharing about that. And I find that tremendously enriching. both because I know that I'm going to share about it with somebody, but I also then get enriched by what other people have found and how they found it enlightening or challenging, what they noticed, what I noticed. Because often, like with movies, we notice different things about a book, and then sharing with someone else will just pick out new things. So, yeah, I just wanted to share about that.
Thanks, Fiona. I think I saw Trish's hand up. Trish?
Yes, thank you. Larry and Sharon, thank you, and everybody else who has spoken. I resonated with so much that you said. And Larry, at the moment, this is what I have beside my bed, and you are giving me some lovely insights into the Gospel of John. And I particularly like your phrase, the law of gradualness. And I'm applying that to my own life and to the things that are happening around us. I find that very enlightening, and I love the way you write. Sharon, I will buy your books. I haven't bought it yet, but having heard you before and now again today, I really want to do that. Larry spoke about some of the great mystical writers that we have, starting with Augustine. And honestly, we have the most wonderful tradition of mystical writers that we can fall back on and that will feed us. These are people from the early centuries and those that are living today. I have also found, as somebody said lately, some non-Christian writers. The one I love is Rumi, R-U-M-I. I just love his writing, his poetry, and what he can put into one little line or sentence is quite incredible. We have such richness, and I think that my spiritual growth has come largely from spiritual reading, including what Anne was saying, that she and I, when I was still in the novitiate, we went through the poems, the Psalms, on Sunday morning, one psalm at a time. In those days, we were still praying the office in Latin, and to read them in an English translation and get to understand them was a wonderful experience that has lasted my whole life, and mine too. So we have this enormously rich tradition of mystical and spiritual writings, which has fed me right through my life and continues to do so. In fact, there are so many books available that it was lovely to see that remark from Sue Rucosi, we don't find books, they find us. And that's true. We have the right book at the right time in our life. And as Sharon said, if it doesn't speak to us, leave it and take another one, because we will find the right one. And at the moment, Larry, Become Love is the right book for me. It's taking me very gently through this time in my life. Thank you, and thank you all.
Thank you, Trish. That was very touching. Bless you.
Just to add to what Trish said about Larry's book, I also absolutely loved the stories of the characters. They came alive for me when I read his book quite a few times. I had to read it when he was going through the editing phases. And I loved they came alive, and it was like reading a novel of stories of people. And then after a while, after reading it a few times, I would go into an imagination experience similar to a contemplative experience. So if for example, if you imagine yourself as the woman at the well, so when you've read the story about the woman at the well, you can imagine yourself being at the well and Jesus meeting you there. So it can become a personal story that you're going to tell yourself of what happens in your imagination with Jesus meeting you there, or any other one of them, the woman caught in adultery. You can imagine Jesus there where there's a time when you are being accused of anything in life, or people are going against you or disagreeing with you and giving you a bit of a hard time. You can put Jesus in your imagination right into your situation, just like that. And then the process is gradual of transformation and change, and Jesus being at the heart of the story.
I see that somebody has raised their hand. Mary or Mari, not sure how to pronounce the name. Please go ahead and ask your question.
It's Moira, it's an Irish name.
Sorry.
Hello, Moira.
Hi, Larry. And
good to see you.
Yeah, thanks very much for your talks today. I just re-echo with what one of the other people attending mentioned, of the fact, like, I've been in book clubs, regular book clubs for years, but never anything to do with faith or spiritual writing. And last year, our local curate started up a parish book club. So once a month we were meeting prior to COVID on something of a spiritual nature. And it's been fantastic because, like, I'm new to the parish, go to Mass on Sunday when we could before COVID. You come away again, but there's no sense of community, whereas going to a book club, sharing our experience of reading the spiritual writing, we're sharing our faith with one another, and it's been a real affirmation of one's faith, and to discover there's other people actually care about their faith. And it's been a wonderful experience to have that opportunity to share, one's reflections on spiritual writing. So it certainly helped me a lot.
Thanks, Moira. Nice to see you. So now we've got someone from Ireland and someone from Canada. Lovely. Did anyone else have a hand up? Anyone else want to share something? Let me just mention a little bit about Brenda Smith-James's book. Brenda's here. She's from Canada. She wrote a book called When God Says No. And the title immediately attracted me. And it's an autobiography, and it's about her faith journey through her mother's illness and death, and through her relationship with her father. So it's filled with passages from the Bible and filled with her faith journey and growth as well. So another very inspiring book, worth reading as a spiritual book, even though it's an autobiography. And Brenda will be talking to us next year. We only have a few copies in South Africa, and the rest are all in Canada. So with COVID, I don't know how we get them here, but Brenda will talk about her book anyway next year.
Can I just come back to my point? I see we've only got 5 minutes left. About you read to know you're not alone. I put it rather technically, I suppose, occupational hazard as a theologian, but what I would call the reciprocity of narrative. And Sharon and I actually adopted that approach in our preparation for today, that one person's story evokes something in yourself, and we immediately find ourselves resonating. But we've got to be very, very careful with brother ego, if you're male, or sister ego, if you're female, because immediately you're going to think, oh, well, you know, my story is this. I think I remember 2 old priests in the community that we had once, and you'd hear them at breakfast, and they had all their ailments of age, and one would say, oh, how I suffer from my arthritis. And the other one would say, you think you suffer? You don't know what suffering is. Let me tell you how I suffer. It's not a competition of who suffers the most, or my story is better than your story. The reciprocity of narrative must be something life-giving. And for that to be possible requires the art of listening. And so you read a book with a listening ear. And I think that and a listening heart. And not just to say, oh, well, I can tell this better because of my experience, but to say, wow, thank you for what you have shared, and try with empathy to enter into the other's reality. Read a book empathetically, and then you will resonate in a less egotistical way. And then narrative does become reciprocal and feed into the law of gradualness in spiritual development in all of us as a community, which we have already claimed ourselves to be. Sharon?
Yeah, I was really struck with what Nontando said about community as the mirror. And to me, there is such a power in that, in both in spiritual reading and in community, is that sense of having a mirror held up to one, which is really important for any kind of transformation, that the kind of awareness that we bring to each other, but also the way that we can feed one another with our insights and our listening. And so I found that to be quite an interesting takeaway. But also just to hear from each person here how spiritual reading has nourished you, and that sense of not being alone, that there's a timelessness to the community that we're part of, you know, from hundreds of years ago, that we're all together in this quest. And yeah, so that is a beautiful sense of being together on this journey, and through this medium of Zoom, where you know, some in Canada or Ireland, but we're a community together, and that's a beautiful gift. So thank you for joining us today in this.
Thank you, Sharon.
Bernie wanted
Thank you, Larry.
I just wanted to say thank you very, very much to Larry and to Sharon. I've only just recently met Sharon in her bigger picture talks, and also the unselfing video that you did recently, or I received it recently. And lovely to meet you on Zoom, Larry. And I look forward to buying both your books. Thank you.
Thank you, Bernie.
Thank you, Bernie. So I just want to reinforce again, I think that most of you have got both Larry and Sharon's books. And I really believe they complement each other. And gradually, as I've got to discuss more with Larry and Sharon, and I've read both their books quite a few times, they really complement each other through contemplation, action, and call to discipleship, which a call to discipleship is similar to a call to action after the contemplation and the reading and the spiritual reading. So once again, Larry and Sharon, thank you so much. It's so heartwarming to share this time with you. And to Eugene for hosting this Coffee with God today. And he is recording it, so if any of your friends would like to listen to it, I will send it to you. And to all of you for participating in all the Coffee with God. There's such a warm, loving community here, and we can feel it over the waves. So thank you, everybody. And I hope you have very prayerful, contemplative, spiritual Advent time starting tomorrow.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Bonnie, Larry.
Bless.
Thank you,
Bye
everybody.
now.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.